Or pay up. That's the key message on the fourth day of the COP29 summit in Baku, also called Finance Day. Campaigners called on developed countries to take more responsibility for the climate crisis. About 50 demonstrators gathered at the COP29 venue earlier in the day, demanding that rich countries responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions pay their share of climate finance.
We've had a really powerful action here on Finance Day at COP29 because finance is the key issue at these negotiations. We know that the world can't address the climate crisis unless the rich countries actually pay up for the harm they've caused to the global south.
Negotiations over a new draft of a UN climate deal have yet to yield results as developing countries continue to push for $1.3 trillion every year in climate finance. That amount is more than 10 times the $100 billion currently provided by a few wealthy nations, including the US and Japan. And more, we're joined by CNA's climate change correspondent Jack Bord. He's live in Baku. Jack, we've been talking a lot about climate finance over just the last 3-4 days. Renewable energy targets, they are part of that picture in terms of possibly reducing the cost of providing energy. How would they fit in with this issue of finding the money for developing countries?
That's right. At last year's COP28, a major pledge was made to try and triple the amount of installed renewable energy by 2030, a major target that was seen as quite an important breakthrough at that time. And given the amount of emissions that the energy sector is responsible for, it is considered a must if the world is going to try and curb global warming to within 1.5 degrees. Right now, though, what we've seen is there are major gaps between what governments have announced and what policies actually exist and have been rolled out across the entire world. And if we look at developing countries, there's also a major financing gap that would enable countries to change their energy mix. Now, I just spoke recently to the head of the International Renewable Energy Agency. He told me that the business case for installing more renewables all around the world has never been clearer.
Renewables are the most competitive way to produce power. Last year, 87% of new installed capacity in the world was renewable, 473 gigawatts. 473 gigawatts means that in 1 year we have installed more power capacity with renewables that in 70 years with nuclear. So this is the sense of the speed and the scale of the transformation.
And Jack, of course, we've heard the business case for essentially transitioning to clean energy, but right here in the region, Southeast Asian countries have a mixed track record in terms of transitioning to clean energy. How much of that might change if climate finance is negotiated at COP29?
Yeah, these types of forums are extremely essential for trying to change the energy outlook for countries in developing countries and right throughout Southeast Asia. There's been new data, new findings released today here at COP29 that paints kind of a mixed picture about what's happening in terms of the renewables rollout right across Southeast Asia. On one hand, we see that the fossil fuels that are being installed is massively increasing, and that's being led by countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines and Vietnam. They're still increasing the amount of fossil fuels in the pipeline. Some $142 billion has been invested in the sector since the Paris Agreement was signed. And what's striking is that a lot of the financing for these fossil fuels come from financial institutions in the global north. Now, these are the countries that are at the same time putting pressures on countries in the developing world to decarbonise. And then on the other hand, if you look at the domestic banking sector throughout Southeast Asia, it's actually these domestic banks that have now become the leading investor in renewables. So I spoke to Jerry Arances from the organisation SEED, who released these findings today.
We need to curb financing from the north to fossil fuel expansion in the region in Southeast Asia, but also look at how do we hasten financing and support domestic banks that are already leading the charge in terms of renewable energy financing in the region.
So here in Baku, Wesu, I can tell you that there is still a lot of wrangling, a lot of disputes and disagreements about that greater climate goal that we've been talking about, trying to raise huge amounts of climate financing for the developing world. Some of those disputes around the exact figure that parties would agree to and also the source of that funding. Of course, developing countries looking for more than $1 trillion a year going forward.
And we'll see if they reach that deal and maybe down to the wire again. CNA's climate change correspondent Jack Ward live from Baku in Azerbaijan.